If you have any level of familiarity with both Japanese and Korean, you likely have noticed lexical similarities between the two languages. These pairs are plentiful and easy to find, and their resemblance is clearly not accidental. To an outside observer, it may seem like the reason for this is pretty simple. The languages must be related, just like Italian and French, or German and Dutch. I wouldn't fault anyone for thinking this way considering the geographical proximity of the two languages. However, this is not the case, as Japanese and Korean most likely don't share a common ancestor. Unless you believe in the Altaic theory, in which case only God can help you. You will struggle to find any examples of cognates between native Japanese and native Korean vocabulary. This means that these thousands of clearly related words in both languages must come from an external source, and that source is, unsurprisingly, Chinese. It's not uncommon for languages to borrow copious amounts of vocabulary from a highly influential and prestigious foreign language spoken around the same general area. I often say that Chinese was to East Asia what Latin and ancient Greek were to Europe, and parallels between the linguistic landscapes on both continents are conspicuous. If you're surprised that over half of Japanese and Korean vocabulary originates from Chinese, look no further than the composition of the English lexicon, complete with the fact that in both cases loans are more plentiful but less frequent. This is because basic words like pronouns, prepositions, and common verbs are disproportionately frequent and also disproportionately likely to be native. And if it strikes you as odd that two allegedly unrelated languages would share so much vocabulary sourced from yet another language, well, here's a few Greek loans in English, Hungarian, and Georgian, 3 completely unrelated languages. Going back to Japanese and Korean, if you know one of these languages and, say, start learning the other, you will realize that this huge bank of shared vocabulary is a great asset, allowing you to understand quite a bit with minimal learning, and giving you a head start compared to other learners. Well, that and the fact that both languages have basically the same grammar, but I digress. But to utilize this asset, you need to learn how to get as much out of it as possible. Sure, while some words are very similar at first glance, others maybe not so much. Even so, after a while, you will likely spot some patterns. All these readings that end in l in Korean end in ts in Japanese. That can't be a coincidence. And that's just one pattern, so clearly there's more. And maybe you could figure out a system, however convoluted it might be, that would allow you to transition from one language to the other, of course within the area of Chinese borrowings, with relative ease. That's what I wanted to find out. I'm a big fan of comparative linguistics, and also someone who studied Korean after studying Japanese. Noticing the similarities between kanji and hanja made me want to look for patterns and equivalences, and summarize them in a systematic way. Well, nearly 10 years later, I finally did it. The sensible way to go about it would probably be to find a paper that's already done it and to summarize it. But that sounds like way too much effort. I'm lazy, I don't like to read. So what I did instead is I manually went through a list of 2100 common kanji and wrote down their Japanese and Korean readings, then wrote down all correspondences between the two languages, grouped them together and summarized them in a table, and then grouped them again and summarized them in another table, which I then turned into another table, and seeing the patterns made me dive into historical developments in Japanese phonology, which then prompted me to look at psychotic tables of Middle Chinese rhyme correspondences, and at that point I came to my senses and I thought to myself, you know what, maybe that's enough for now. And I want to present my findings in today's video in excruciating detail because I didn't make all these charts for nothing. If you want to avoid linguistic spurging and you're just interested in a general overview, I probably put a summary at the end, so just go look at that. Before we get started, I want to introduce some terms. Some of them you might be already familiar with, but I just want to be thorough. Hanja and kanji are the Korean and Japanese terms for Chinese characters. In English, the terms generally mean Chinese characters as used in Korean and Japanese, respectively, and that's how I'll be using them throughout this video. Chinese writing has been borrowed both into Japanese and Korean, although in modern Korean it's very rarely employed, as the language has opted for the use of its native alphabet, Hangul, and the average Korean speaker can only read very basic hanja. Chinese loans, however, are all over the place. It's just harder to identify them as such due to the phonetic spelling. You will find hanja in dictionaries, as they're the best way to show etymology. In Japanese, on the other hand, kanji are alive and well, used in conjunction with two syllabaries. Unlike in Korean, the characters are used to encode native words as well. In short, a Korean speaker who can't read hanja will understand nothing from a Japanese text, but if they look up how to read a word, or if they hear it, they might link it to an equivalent Korean word. Elements borrowed from Chinese, including Chinese readings used in the two languages, are called Sino-Japanese and Sino-Korean, or collectively Sinitic. Sinitic pronunciations of kanji are called onyomi, as opposed to kunyomi, which are readings created when kanji were applied to native Japanese vocabulary. In dictionaries, onyomi are generally written in katakana and kunyomi in hiragana. Their Korean equivalents are umdok and hundok. We're only interested in these because, as mentioned previously, Japanese and Korean don't share native vocabulary. While Korean rarely employs multiple readings per hanja, kanji with multiple readings are extremely common. This is because Japanese borrowed Chinese characters in several waves over the course of a few centuries. The two main waves are called goon and kaon, although there are a few others which are rare. This means that, as a general rule, a kanji has two Sinitic readings. However, A, in some cases the two readings are identical, and B, it's rare that the two readings are equally common. The question you may have is, if a kanji has multiple readings, how do you know which is used in a given word? And the answer is, you don't.
No, crazy Japanese!
One more difference between character use in Japanese and Korean is that Japanese has simplified some of its kanji. These simplified forms are called shinjitai. In Korean, if hanja are used at all, they're not simplified. Throughout the video, I will be using the Japanese forms by default, but if they differ from their traditional/Korean forms, I will include those forms as well. My main goal in this video is to present Korean readings of hanja, compare them to their Japanese equivalents, and attempt to establish patterns that would help in predicting the Japanese kanji readings. In this video, I will specifically focus on the transfer from Korean to Japanese. I will also do it the other way around, but in a separate video. When I present the patterns I have found, I will sometimes try to explain how they came about based on historical developments, but this is not the focus of the video. Most of the time, the sound changes involved are so convoluted that trying to analyze them would just make things needlessly confusing. So I will only include cases that are pretty simple and clear-cut, so you can look at a pattern and go, oh, that's why. And now to the main question of the video that I've been avoiding answering, but I have to do it at some point. Can you, knowing the reading of a hanja, predict, with a decent chance of success, the reading of its kanji equivalent? No, it's not even close, I'm not gonna lie. Like 1,000 years ago, when these borrowings were fresh, you might have had a slightly easier time, but since then the two languages have taken their own paths of evolution, which further complicates the task. Probably in another 1,000 years it will be even harder, because language change is inevitable. This, of course, also applies to Chinese, which is why whenever I'm referring to the original Chinese pronunciations of characters, I'm talking about Middle Chinese, not modern Mandarin. Especially not Mandarin, because as crazy as it sounds, you could argue that it has diverged from Middle Chinese more than Sino-Korean and even Sino-Japanese. Southern Chinese languages are admittedly much more conservative. But even though you're not likely to guess a kanji reading based on its hanja equivalent, that's not the end of the world. Characters rarely occur in isolation, usually they're a part of a word that contains two or maybe three of them. And so if you, let's say, see an unfamiliar Sino-Korean word and try to figure out its Japanese equivalent, while you can't be sure about any of the individual characters, when you see them together, you're more likely to figure out the whole word. Now, this hinges on the presupposition that Sinitic words in both languages always mean the same thing, which isn't the case, and that a Sinitic word in one language will always exist in the other, which is also not the case, but to be fair, most of the time it works. My methodology for this little study was as follows. I used the Joyo Kanji Hyo, which is a list of about 2,100 most common kanji used in Japanese. Obviously, there are thousands of other rarer characters, but I figured this was a good enough sample size. I then compiled their Sino-Korean and Sino-Japanese readings. I excluded kanji made in Japan because, well, they're exclusive to Japan and have no phonetic readings because, where would you get them from? And obviously they're not used in Korean, so there's nothing to compare. Some characters had multiple possible readings. This number was 31 for Korean and 268 for Japanese. Now, if the Japanese number seems way too low to you, it's because it is. This is because I only included readings found in Joyo Kanji Hyo, which, apart from listing all kanji allowed to be used in official documents, also contains a list of permitted readings for each kanji, which is not always exhaustive. Other attested readings may very well exist, they were just not deemed common enough to be put on the list. But disregarding them in the case of my analysis is relatively inconsequential, since we're just trying to establish general cross-linguistic patterns. After I compiled all readings in both languages, I wrote down all correspondences between them, of which there were 861, and sorted them according to their Korean initials, finals, and codas. These three terms refer to the constituent elements making up character readings. Each Chinese glyph can be described in terms of its initial, i.e. the initial consonant, its final, i.e. everything after the initial consonant, which is either a vowel or a diphthong with an optional final consonant, the coda, and its tone. We can disregard the tones, as neither Japanese nor Korean have those. For each group I sorted, I looked at what it's statistically most likely to correspond to in Japanese, and from there I tried to establish some more general patterns between the two languages. For some finals, I could only find a handful of examples, so to prevent the results from being skewed by the small sample size, I added a few characters from outside Joyo Kanji Hyo to compensate for these underrepresentations. Because I had to manually analyze over 2,000 characters, I most likely made some mistakes here and there. But again, in the whole scheme of things, it doesn't really matter because we're looking at general patterns, so any outliers caused by a stray mistake would basically surface as a rounding error. And as thorough as I try to be, in the end this isn't a PhD, it's a video from my shitpost YouTube channel. As mentioned previously, we will be looking at initials, finals, and codas. These are the 13 initials in Japanese and the 13 initials in Korean. And these are the 43 Japanese finals and the 75 Korean finals. Not all initials can go with all finals, so if we add some basic rules, we get a total of 450 technically possible Japanese readings and 814 technically possible Korean readings. If we confront that with the number of unique readings actually found across the analyzed 2100-ish characters, it's only like half. Again, this list is by no means exhaustive, so the actual number of attested readings in both languages is likely higher, but probably not by much. Looking at these lists, we can also see what codas are allowed in each language, although Japanese only allows a nasal coda, so the rest require additional vowels. And speaking of codas, we will start by looking at them, as they are the most straightforward by far. Middle Chinese had 6 codas, 3 plosives and 3 nasals. They correspond to these codas in Korean. As you can see, they're almost identical except t is rendered as l. In Japanese, things get a little more complicated. First off, both m and n are leveled to a single nasal coda. It's usually romanized as n, but its pronunciation generally depends on what follows it. These are by far the most consistent, so if you see a Korean reading ending in m or n, it will always surface as n in Japanese. When it comes to the k final, because ending a syllable in k is impossible in Japanese, an additional vowel is inserted, depending on what the preceding vowel is. After e, we get ki. After a, u, o, we get k, and after i, we can get either ki or k. Ki is approximately 4 times rarer than k, and these are all Korean finals in which ki appears. Even when we look at all of them combined, ki is still rarer than k, but if we take the 2 most common ones, ok and yok, the number jumps to 60%, which is admittedly still pretty low, but these are the finals where you're most likely to see ki in the equivalent Japanese readings. The t final, which in Korean is l, is very similar to the one we discussed. Just like with k, we get t plus either u or i, but because of sound changes, these syllables are pronounced as zi and chi in modern Japanese. Zi is much more common, as chi only occurs in Goon readings, and even among those, zi is more common. These are all 9 characters with chi on the list, and as you can see, most of them also have equivalent readings ending in zi. So you can safely assume that Korean le almost always corresponds to Japanese zi. If you're familiar with Japanese, you're likely aware that kanji ending in zi sometimes change depending on the following consonant, but I'll talk about Japanese sound changes at the end, after the analysis. Things get more interesting when we look at the remaining 2 codas. The velar nasals were borrowed into Japanese as nasal vowels, a nasal I after e and a nasal u after a, u, o, a similar pattern to the k coda. This nasality was later lost, leaving us with sequences of 2 vowels. In a similar 4:1 ratio as the k final, the ng final is more likely to surface in Japanese as u than as i. I will add that in Toon readings, ng is realized as n, but these readings are quite rare. You will mostly see them in loans from modern Chinese. And finally, the p final was initially appended with an epenthetic u, because again, you can't end a Japanese syllable with a p. Unfortunately for us, p was one of the only consonants in Japanese to undergo pretty drastic sound changes. Specifically, between vowels it mutated to w, and then w disappeared everywhere except in the syllable wa, meaning our initial pu ending ended up being reduced to just u. However, in some cases the p final was instead interpreted as a doubling of the following consonant, which was similar to how the t final was treated. And via analogy, these p finals eventually became zi. These readings are relatively rare, as they only account for 15% of the p final characters I analyzed, and here you can see a list of all of them. All of them are examples of kanyon, which is a class of readings separate from the main waves I introduced earlier, and they can be called a form of corrupted readings, as they don't follow the patterns of how Chinese readings were adapted to Japanese. But because they were used so commonly, they were accepted as part of the official language. But this is not the end of the story for the ng and p finals. Almost all of them ended up creating sequences of 2 vowels, one immediately after the other, also known as hiatus. Around the 9th century, Japanese underwent a series of sound changes known as onbin. One of these changes involved the fusion of vowel sequences into long vowels, and this affected many kanji readings. The cases that are relevant for us are au, u, and el, which turned into o, u, and yo, respectively. You can see this in these examples. Now, you don't really need to know these historical sound changes, but it makes certain patterns easier to understand. For example, if I may jump ahead for a second, the Korean vowel a is generally kept as a in Japanese readings, regardless of what codas you add to it. However, if we look at ng and p, we see that adding the most common equivalent u would result in au, while in reality we get o. So this doesn't really introduce an irregularity into the pattern with a random o instead of a, it just follows a set of sound changes. Here's a summary of codas and a few examples, which you can take a look at before we move on. I will also note that, while codas are generally quite stable, there are cases where they completely mismatch, but these usually involve corrupted readings that have become standardized. They're rare, but don't be surprised if you come across them. Now we can move on to initial consonants. I won't get too into the historical details and focus on the correspondences, but I will include mentions of the original Chinese initials if I want to explain some unusual phenomena. Starting with nasals, we have mium, which corresponds to either m or b, and nian, which corresponds to either n or d, in both cases in approximately a 6:4 ratio. The nasal readings come from goon and the voiced plosives from kaon. In addition, 7% of the nian readings on the list correspond to t in Japanese. These are more examples of the aforementioned kanyon, which are corrupted or modified readings. One thing to note is that if a Japanese reading starts with d and is palatalized, i.e. comes before e or y, the spelling changes to the za row. In modern Japanese, z and d have the same pronunciation before palatalizers, except in some dialects. And so in the case of Sino-Japanese kanji readings, all instances of palatal d were respelled to z. The same thing, by the way, happens before u, where both of these syllables are pronounced as z, except in some dialects. So any spellings with d were changed to z. This is just so you know, anytime I say something corresponds to the da row, these changes must be applied. And to finish off, I know ing is not a nasal syllable initially, but historically it makes sense to put it together with other nasals, as we'll see soon. The Korean no onset corresponds to the Japanese no onset, so the aro or the yaro. But this is only the case about 65% of the time. About 20% of the time, it's rendered in Japanese as g, which fits nicely with our other secondary readings, finishing the voiced plosive trifecta. This is because while the no onset originated from the Chinese glottal stop in the y initials, the velar nasal initial was dropped in Korean, but denasalized to g in Japanese. Even rarer are readings in which Japanese ends up as palatal n or z. Those beginning with n come from goon, and those with z from kaon. These readings stem from the Middle Chinese ny initial. One thing to note is that in Japanese, the vowel e never follows a palatalized consonant, so before e, these readings are depalatalized to ne and ze. Finally, just like with Nyan, where some readings were devoiced from d to t, we have a few kanyon readings where the g is k instead. Following this pattern, you might expect something similar with b to p for miyam, but this doesn't happen because Sino-Japanese readings cannot start with a p. Let's move on to stops. Korean has 9 of them, 3 plain, 3 aspirated, and 3 tense. But half of them are pretty much never used as initials of hanja readings, which leaves us with these 5. However, for the purposes of our analysis, the plain aspirated distinction doesn't really matter, because both piup and piup end up as Japanese h or b in a similar ratio, and both tigut and tiut surface as t or d, again in a similar ratio. The remaining kiok, as you might expect, corresponds to either k or g. The voiced Japanese readings stem from Middle Chinese voiced plosive initials, but only in goon. As you can see, there were 2 alveolars, which is likely why the ratio for these initials is the most balanced. I've also found a total of 2 characters which have the kiok initial in Korean, but a no onset in Japanese. These are outliers, but I wanted to mention them. Looking at the old Chinese reconstruction, I presume these came about because the uvular stop fronted in Korean but disappeared in Japanese, with an intermediate step where it was a glottal stop, as we can see in the Middle Chinese reconstruction. The plosives are pretty nice and symmetrical, but you might be thinking, hold on for a second, h doesn't voice to b, shouldn't it be p instead? And you would be absolutely right. Remember when I mentioned p is one of the only consonants in Japanese that underwent substantial changes? Well, h used to be p. As I said earlier, between vowels it changed to w, and later w disappeared except in wa. After a nasal coda, or when geminated, it remained as p, which will be very relevant, but much later in the video. Otherwise, p turned into h, and later h, with some allophones, but I digress. And as a kanji initial, h replaced p in all cases. Speaking of h, let's look at the hiat initial. Similarly to kiok, this initial's primary Japanese reflex is k, followed by g. In a few cases you also get w, though as I mentioned earlier, w disappeared everywhere except in wa. These rare readings originate from the realization of the Middle Chinese labialized velar fricatives in goon. As far as the rest of the fricatives are concerned, siot is the most straightforward, as it corresponds to Japanese s about 80% of the time, and is voiced equivalent otherwise. If you're curious about where they originate from, here you go. But unfortunately, Middle Chinese had a ton of sibilant initials, so their Korean and Japanese reflexes are pretty messy. Similarly to other plain aspirate pairs, jiet and tiet correspond to the same Japanese initials, the most common being s, followed by t and then z. However, there are some differences I've noticed between the two. For one, while jiet does correspond to t, it's always a palatalized t, though as was the case with palatal n and z for ing, before you just get a non-palatal t. Another difference is that jiet has a fourth counterpart, d, but I've only found it in 7 characters. Well, in reality there are more, but those were palatalized and respelled, so it makes more sense to just lump them together with z. Again, here are the original Chinese initials for anyone interested, but you can see how convoluted these are. And the final initial is riel. It corresponds to Japanese r. Yes, always. It's the only initial with a simple one-to-one correspondence. But just before you get too excited, you need to remember that Korean, or at least South Korean, features a rule called tuumbopchik, which states that 1. Word initial adiel changes to nian, and 2. Word initial nian turns to ing before palatalizers. What you can extrapolate from that is that word initial adiel turns into ing when palatalized. What complicates things further is the character for 6, which is supposed to fall into this category as its reading was originally ryuk. However, I guess Koreans decided that having 2 separate forms for a number depending on its position in the word is a little confusing, so they just stuck with yuk in all environments. Let's summarize all initials. Korean nasals correspond to Japanese nasals or homorganic voiced stops, which may be devoiced in corrupted readings. In addition, the Korean null onset corresponds to the Japanese null onset, and in some cases to palatal n or z. Korean stops correspond to Japanese voiceless stops, more rarely to their voiced counterparts, though p is h instead. Hiet is very similar to kiok, but occasionally surfaces as w, though the glide is only preserved before a. Siot continues the pattern, usually corresponding to the voiceless s, and sometimes to the voiced z. The other 2 sibilants also most commonly correspond to s, but sometimes to t or z. In addition, Tsiet's secondary reading is usually palatalized, and there's actually an even rarer counterpart, that being d. Finally, the only Korean liquid corresponds to the only Japanese liquid, no exceptions. Here's a few examples, as many as I could fit on the screen. Are these really all the possible Korean initials? Well, no. On the list, I found 4 examples of rare initials, 1 with aspirated k, and 3 with tense obstruents. There are a few more that you could find, but they're far and few in between, and they just behave like they're more common counterparts, so there's no need to worry about those. Finally, we can look at finals, which are definitely the most messy and unpredictable, which makes sense since vowels are more volatile than consonants. In a perfect world, we would take a Korean vowel and find a Japanese equivalent, and if there are codas, we just stick them at the end based on the equivalents we discussed earlier. But this is not a perfect world, so we'll see more variation. I will be presenting finals in groups based on their Korean vowels, since that's optimal for establishing patterns. Let's start with a vowel I previously mentioned when discussing codas, and that is a. This vowel is relatively stable, as for the most part it corresponds to its Japanese counterpart with the same pronunciation. There are, however, a few things to note. One is that if the final features no coda, it most commonly corresponds to a after most consonants, but to either i or ya after the 3 sibilants. These 3 consonants can sometimes spice things up, and you'll see that they're repeat offenders when it comes to breaking simple patterns. I is twice as likely as ya in these cases. After other initials, plain a is dominant. Another thing to note has to do with the p and ng codas, which undergo the previously discussed onbin changes. So for p, you would originally have apu, which then changed to au, and then to o. Similarly for ng, you would have had ang, then ao, and then o. For p, you can also see that the rarer equivalent zi is also found in a few cases, but here we have no vowel change because, well, there's no hiatus. And as for ng, we have a similar case to the bare vowel, where the three sibilants tend to iatate the preceding vowel. Although the final yo is almost always found after these sibilants, the regular o can still be found after them about 40% of the time. Finally, you'll see that with other codas, a can sometimes correspond to other Japanese vowels. And now that I mentioned iotation, let's look at the iotated version of a, ya. This vowel only occurs in these three finals, and is by far the most consistent, as out of all examples I found, it almost always corresponds to Japanese ya. Once again, we need to take onbin into account, as yang goes to yao, which ends up being yo. And finally, let's finish analyzing a by seeing what happens when it's combined with another glide, resulting in wa. Once again, this vowel doesn't co-occur with all possible codas. As I explained before, wa in Japanese has disappeared in most environments, only being preserved in the syllable wa. This does not include medial wa, which only occurred after velar plosives, and which also got dropped. And this means that, for the purposes of our analysis, except for the very few cases with a null onset where the glide is preserved, we can treat Korean wa the same as the plain a, although the Japanese readings historically come from different sources. Fortunately, we don't have to bother with these historical spellings. Thank you, spelling reforms. Here are some examples. To summarize, the general pattern is that a and wa correspond to a, and ya corresponds to ya. One thing to keep in mind with these stats is that the sample sizes of different finals can vary a lot. I'm not showing these stats because that would just be information overload, but for example, something like ang has over 90 characters, while lak only has 4. Obviously, the larger the sample size, the better understanding we can have about the correspondence patterns, and with these rare finals, I tried to compensate by including characters from outside the analyzed list, especially when the pattern wasn't clear, but it's still not ideal. Either way, flipping the vowel 180 degrees, we move on to a. This vowel usually corresponds to Japanese e, with the exception of pia, which for some reason corresponds to a. There are some other vowel mutations. The other exception is when there is no coda, in which case the most common equivalent is yo. The second most common realization is e, which only occurs after the three sibilants. When it comes to the k coda, you may or may not remember that e is the only vowel that is never followed by k, so the most common reading is eki, followed by yaku, which again only occurs after sibilants. As for the p coda, once again we have onbin changes, so the original epu goes through eu and ends up as yo. And once again, the rarer ending zi causes no vowel change. Finally, looking at the velar nasal coda, we either get e in kaon or yo in goon, with the former being more common. When discussing this coda, I mentioned that if the preceding vowel was e, it was followed by a nasal e, which was later denasalized, and that's how we end up with e. As for yo, it actually comes from yang. In fact, most kanji in the set have both readings, the yo ones coming from gon and the e ones coming from kaon. More interestingly, I don't think this Korean final actually exists. And what do I mean by that? Well, one way our favorite sibilants are special is that they cannot occur before iotated vowels, meaning that if they ever were to, the vowel would just turn into its plain counterpart. Looking at the supposed ong final, all 49 characters on the list are preceded by one of the three sibilants. And I'm almost certain that this means these actually come from the yong final, but the vowel was just changed because of the preceding consonants. And speaking of iotated vowels, although the plain a is more likely to mutate to other vowels, for the most part ya behaves the same way as a, even down to secondary readings, likely due to two things. For one, as I just mentioned, these two sets ended up being mixed due to necessary vowel changes after sibilants. And also, is the only vowel in Japanese which cannot be iotated, so it would always just end up as plain anyway. The only major difference is the whole thing with changing to after piup is not a thing for this vowel. Finally, just like with wa, the medial glide in equivalence of wa is not preserved in Japanese. Again, here are examples. This means that in the end, all three vowels, a, ya, and wa, most commonly correspond to Japanese unless there is no coda, in which case it's generally yo. However, plain a with codas corresponds to a after piup. Moving on, we have e. This vowel very regularly corresponds to the Japanese e, but with coda k and ng, it instead comes up as yo. With the k coda, e is also found, albeit less commonly, and is followed by ki rather than k. With p, once again we have vowel changes, as we go from ipu to iu and then yu. And once again, the alternative reflex tsu involves no vowel mutation. We also have rare cases with different vowels, but less commonly than was the case with the previous two sets. This vowel too can be preceded by the glide w to form wi, although this vowel is never followed by codas. As with the previous sets, the historical glide in Japanese was lost, so we end up with a plain e. Other finals, like ui, are also not uncommon though. Let's also look at u. This vowel never occurs on its own and always requires a coda. The general pattern here is that it corresponds to o before k and ng, and to e otherwise. You will, however, see o even with codas where e is dominant, and some more variation for the velar codas. We get more onbin here, as for p, we start with ipu, which mutates to iu, and finally yu. And once again, no onbin needed when the coda becomes tsu. Here's a list of examples, and a quick summary. Now let's look at more horizontal vowels, starting with o. This vowel isn't very predictable when no codas are involved, as it either corresponds to o, or yo, or some others, without a stark preference for any one final. Once again, our patterns are disturbed by sibilants, as yo and yo are almost always found after those, and the others are almost always found after other initials, although the iotated finals only follow sibilants about half of the time. This leads me to suspect that, again, many of these are actually de-iotized yos. When there is a coda, we generally get o plus the expected coda equivalent, but different vowels do crop up as well. I decided to treat u and yu as subsets of u and because the former only occur after sibilants and the latter only after non-sibilants. Yo is fairly straightforward as we go from o to yo and o to yo. What I found really odd though is that with these finals, yo and o come from eu and au, which doesn't really pattern with the others in the set, but the fact that used to be a palatalizer in Japanese probably has something to do with that. Let's see some examples. To summarize this vowel, o usually corresponds to Japanese o, or o if there is no coda, while yo corresponds to yo, but to yo if there is no coda. Turn that frown upside down and we get to u. This vowel is also quite unpredictable, especially with no coda. It can correspond to yu, o, or a few others. With codas, it has a preference for a short u after velars and u after other codas. And here, once again, I counted u as a subset of u, which occurs after sibilants. In fact, the finals yun, yutsu, and yuku can only occur after sibilants to begin with. The ending e is also found, specifically with coda k and also m, although as far as I know, there is only one hanja with the final so there's not much to compare it to. There is a considerable vowel variation with other codas though. U is equally unpredictable, generally corresponding to U or U with no coda, but with some other possibilities, to U or Yo with the velar nasal, and to E otherwise. let's look at some examples. Summarizing these finals isn't easy, but you could say that the general pattern is that for the plain U, you get or U with no coda, U after K and Ng, and U after other codas, but U following sibilants. For the iotated U, you get U with no coda, U or Yo with the velar nasal, and E with other codas. Now let's tackle two vowels which have a few things in common. One is that both only occur with either no coda or one of the velar codas. The other is that they have the same most common correspondences. I'm talking about e and we, which both become I or a if there is a coda. Once again, we can't forget the onbin for ao. The only point of difference is that historically the latter vowel had a medial w in Japanese, but then it was lost. Also, e has more variation as it sometimes corresponds to other vowels, although plain we is guilty of that as well. And to finish off, we have 5 miscellaneous finals, none of which occur with codas. Starting with e and ye, both corresponding to e, less commonly I, sometimes other vowels. Then we have we, which could be just about anything, although most commonly e. Then we have we, which is also all over the place, though most commonly I. And finally, the last final is the, which seems to always correspond to e. The last list of examples. To summarize, e and we correspond to I with no coda and a with a coda. The rest of the finals never take a coda, so we should treat them separately. I grouped them together because they were pretty much the leftovers. To cap off this analysis, let's look at everything all at once. First, we have the most straightforward segments, that is codas. The most important thing to keep in mind with them is the vowel changes in case of hiatus. Then we have initials. Korean nasals correspond either to Japanese nasals or their voiced plosive equivalents, though the null onset is usually preserved in Japanese. Korean stops correspond to Japanese voiceless stops, more rarely voiced stops, regardless of the type of articulation of the original Korean plosive. Hyud behaves similarly to kyok. Korean sibilants usually correspond to Japanese se, or its voice equivalent, or sometimes te, and the only Korean liquid becomes the only Japanese liquid. Finally, we have the most complicated segments, finals. In general, you can broadly assume that one Korean vowel will correspond to one Japanese vowel, stick codas at the end, and apply sound changes where relevant, but obviously it's not a very reliable strategy. And here's a very simplified version on one screen. If you want to make use of my findings, I would suggest against using them when producing language, but rather when receiving it. I talked to a Korean person once and assumed akumu would be angmu in Korean, and he was like, what? On the other hand, if you see a Korean word like this, you may or may not be able to deduce its Japanese equivalent. And although I feel like I've uncovered a lot when researching these equivalencies, there are still some questions left unanswered, like what's up with these two codas? Not only are there 4 vowels that only take these two and none of the other ones, I've also found 3 instances where they tend to alter the resultant Japanese vowel.
Mystery.
If you're more knowledgeable than me, feel free to educate me in the comments. Before we wrap up, I want to mention a few things that you need to consider when converting from Korean to Japanese readings. Well, if you figure out a Korean reading, you can just use it in a word and it will remain unchanged, at least in writing, except for tuumboptik. The same cannot be said about Japanese. The first thing that can happen is that a reading may be voiced in the middle of a word, even if the character is generally not listed with that reading. This is not very common, but from what I found, it mostly happens right after a character with a nasal coda, and is a result of the nasal spreading its voicedness to the following consonant, even if said nasal is not retained in the modern language. It can also happen in compounds and with some suffixes. Another thing that can happen, and which is much more common, is gemination, that is, consonant doubling. As I mentioned earlier in the video, this happens with coda t, or l in Korean, which in Japanese is either ts or chi. There are 4 consonants in Japanese that can undergo gemination in these contexts: k, s, t, and h. So if you take a kanji pronounced hatsu and follow it with a kanji pronounced ken, you get hakken instead of hatsuken. But if you take the same character and follow it with gen, you just get hatsugen, because g can't be doubled. Gemination also occurs if you have coda ku or ki followed by another k, as in sakka or sekko, as opposed to sakuka and sekiko. Although sometimes it just doesn't happen or is optional, as in tekikan or tekkan. There are other cases where gemination doesn't occur, like between words and when applying suffixes. Also, I don't think this needs to be mentioned, but only codas can turn into double consonants. So you can turn sekikan into sekkan, but you can't turn shikikan into shikkan. A special case is to be made for the 2 number kanji with coda ku, roku and hyaku. These can double the following consonant not only when it is k, but also h. This happens only with these 2. So roku plus hatsu becomes ropbatsu, but baku plus hatsu doesn't become bapbatsu. You might also notice that when h is geminated, it becomes a double p, and at this point you probably know why. As discussed previously, h used to be p, and as a general rule, only remained p when geminated, or when preceded by a nasal coda. Speaking of which, if a kanji reading ends in n, like in kan, and the following kanji begins with h, as in heki, the h turns into a p, giving us kanpeki, not kanheki. Or, more historically accurately, the p is preserved after n, or in geminates, and turns into h in all other cases. As with any rule, there are exceptions, like this word is zenhan, not zenpan. And just as with gemination, this doesn't happen between words, so compound phrases like tsusin hanbai doesn't become tsusin panbai. The final phenomenon I want to talk about is when we have a nasal coda followed directly by a vowel or semi-vowel. If that happens in Korean, the coda just moves to the beginning of the next syllable. So this is pronounced as if it was written like that, chomon. And this is read as if it was spelled like that, panen. This never happens in Japanese, so these aren't tenin and hano. What happens is, well, 98% of the time, nothing. You just have this awkward transition from a nasal coda into a following vowel or glide, as in tein and hanje and konyaku. However, sometimes you get something called renjo, where an additional nasal is inserted at the beginning of the next syllable. We know by this point that modern Japanese coda n originated from Middle Chinese codas n and m, and this is pretty much the only time where this distinction is still relevant. That's because this inserted nasal is n if the preceding kanji originally had a n coda, and m if it was a m coda. So we get hanno and unnun, but sammi and onmyo. If you know the Korean readings, which retain the n-m split, well, then you won't have trouble figuring out which nasal to insert, but you won't really get a lot of mileage out of this knowledge because renjo is very rare, so people just remember where it occurs on a word-by-word basis. And that's pretty much all there is to know. I'll start working on the inverse of this video, trying to figure out how to convert kanji readings into hanja readings, which I'm assuming is going to be much messier and more unpredictable. In that video, I'll also explore all the weird shit Korean readings do, like turning plosives into nasals, so look out for that.